So my name is Puvan. I am the moderator and I am the founder of Bluenumber, and we are hosting this session. We're very grateful to the OECD Forum for giving us the opportunity to discuss RegTech. We have got I have got three others here with me who are deep into this issue of RegTech, and I'm going to give them, Andre, Abasaheb, and Crispin, a chance to introduce themselves for a minute or so and what their view is on RegTech. And then we're going to get straight into a discussion on some of the key questions which have been posted in the LinkedIn about what is RegTech and what are regulators asking with regard to data and technology that could help them to address some of the social issues on social performance and compliance reporting. So I'm going to go around my screen now, inviting first Andre. Can you tell us who you are, what your organization does, and what is your view on RegTech?
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Puvan, for putting this together. So I'm Andre Ragu. I'm based in New York City, and I'm the CEO of HAP International. What HAP does is essentially work with regulators to verify data as evidence of compliance across the end-to-end supply chain. In a short way, I always say that our work is about not the results, but the proof in the results. And our view on RegTech is really a focus around substantiation of information, right? And when we look at the work that we do in sort of a top-down view of data that's being collected across the end-to-end supply chain, it's all about evidence. And so we look toward the future in terms of data and credible data.
Thanks, Andre. Abasaheb, please introduce yourself and your view on RegTech.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm Abasaheb Kai. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Sahyadri Farms Sustainable Grassroots Initiatives Limited. Sahyadri Farms is one of the largest organizations in India. We have more than 17,000 farmers working for us. We are primarily focused in horticulture crops, but last couple of years, we started working for cotton farmers. Reason was their financial resiliency and unfortunate suicides. What I look from platforms like RegTech is, I think we need to have evidence-based compliance, and we should have voice for the direct beneficiaries or the bottom of the pyramid. I think that's from my side. Thank you, Puvan, for inviting on this call.
Thanks, Abasaheb. So, Crispin.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Puvan, for having us. I'm Crispin Argento. I'm the Managing Director of Sourcery. We are a global sourcing platform that connects brands and manufacturers directly to growers, farmers, who are largely growing cotton, but other crops as well. Our interest, of course, in the RegTech space is to transition, once we're at the farm with the ultimate benefactors of fiber, in this case, cotton, we want to transition, to look at primary data and primary verified data and look at the performance of individual growers and growing communities and reward them for their sustainability advancements. Just like you and I get rewarded for hitting our KPIs at our jobs, growers often don't get rewarded, of course, for performance improvements that they have from a commercial standpoint and or from an environmental standpoint. And that's where we're focused. And RegTech is so important there because we are validating through primary data the claims that are made by brands and retailers and manufacturers on the actual environmental and social and quality performance at farm level. So RegTech for us is very much the future because it validates everything that we are skeptical of in the world of greenwashing that we are now very much entrenched in.
Thanks, Crispin. So to round it off as an introduction, for those of you who don't know what Bluenumber does, we are very much focused on this greenwashing and green hushing issue. We provide an infrastructure for unique identities, interoperable data to attach data to those identities so that data creators can be recognized and rewarded, as Crispin had said, and also for regulators to be able to know the provenance of data and that that data has been obtained without exploitation. So those people who are data creators, i.e. workers and farmers and so forth, have been properly compensated for the data that they are providing in order that there can be a license to operate in any new market. So that's what Bluenumber does. Okay, let's go to the first question, the first topic, which is, I suppose, the big question in the room. Andre, I'm going to ask you, if you're a regulator, you're sitting in the US at CBP, you're sitting in the EU or in the German government, and you are relying on data for human rights compliance. Where do you get that data? How much trust do you have in it currently? And what would you be looking for in a RegTech environment?
So great question. So I'm going to start with the end rather than the beginning. How much trust do I have in the data currently is very little. You know, there is a very strong perception that the information that's available is only what I would call one-way information. It usually comes in the form of maybe an assessment report or a certification of some form. And other than that, there is really no way to triangulate or substantiate this information from a current perspective of regulators, right? And what the desire is to have much more of an area of information that can corroborate the claims that you're making, right? A way to kind of look at the issue comprehensively and holistically. And so for the most part, you know, most regulators are still working through how to determine credible claims that are being made around human rights due diligence laws. And so in our daily work of sort of working with regulators around the substantiation of those claims, you know, generally it's a heavy lift for brands in terms of their admissibility of products, simply because they have not been working in such an environment where there's a need or a demand to be able to substantiate something beyond simply an assessment report of some form or a certification.
So very simply, if somebody were to present a social audit, and we had a Human Rights Watch report late last year about this, how much weight today would a regulator place in a social audit that is presented to them to corroborate or to say that they were in compliance from a human rights due diligence standpoint?
So I'll answer that in two ways. One is that, in my opinion, based on working on a routine basis through merchandise detentions under human rights due diligence laws, very little. But I would also add to that, not simply a regulator, but surprisingly, most commissioners of these audits do not provide them as part of merchandise detention. So that would lead one to perhaps believe that they may, as well in a regulatory context, also not put a great deal of weight on those audits as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask Abba Saheb, you've just completed with Bluenumber a video project to get direct worker voice. Now you provide in your chain, you have cotton farmers all the way through to manufacture of t-shirts. And what you operate is an ethical business, and you make that claim. So why did you do this direct worker voice project? What do you hope a regulator would be able to gain from having this kind of input from your workers to corroborate your claims? And then how would that help to reinforce, for example, the SEDEX audit that you also undergo? So you are already doing all the certifications and audits, but now you've added this other component, which becomes data that you would be willing to share. Why have you done this, and why do you think regulators should listen?
Thanks, Lun. I think as Sahyadri, we believe in trust, transparency, and technology. Most important thing is that we have lots of tools to validate our compliance for regulatory reason, as well as for the group philosophies, group strategies, correct? What we felt was if we give chance or voice to these main eco system stakeholders, it is going to be very, very crucial and important. And mostly, most important thing is that their opinion matters, correct? So whatever you say, if these things are going to be get endorsed by our farmers or our workers, I think it adds real value to what we are talking through our audits, what we are talking through our compliance reports, what we are talking as our vision and mission statements. So it is more and clear transparency what Sahyadri looks at. And one I'm really glad to share with everyone here is we could achieve that through your project of Million Makers and Direct Worker Voice. I think results are pretty transparent, pretty good. And I think your questions were straightforward. To be very frank, most of the time,
Also good.
are addressing the compliance-driven requirements or regulatory requirements, and they are becoming more and more, you can say, constrained between business and reporting. What we are talking here is something going beyond that and involving the last mile stakeholder and give them freedom to talk. That's very important, and that's why we adopted that goal.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. I think that is also what we felt. I mean, just to share, with the group here, you had 100% response rate from all of your factory workers, and they corroborated. In fact, they went beyond the SEDEX report to answer questions that were not actually even within the audit, and primarily over the course of the survey period of 5 days, they confirmed that they were always happy to come to work. Now, these are very important. This is feedback that you can get direct from the worker at any time. So, Crispin, why would that sort of information, I mean, you are involved in granular verification of fiber, of worker sentiment and so forth at this level. Why would that be important to a buyer? And then, to convey that to an end consumer, and how would that increase or enhance the value beyond a simple claim that would be made on a certificate or a label? You're on mute.
I apologize. Yeah, I think I can answer that question fairly succinctly, although I tend to have a difficult time with brevity. But for us, we made a decision at Sorcery when we got down to the farm with our partners that we would collect roughly about, depends on the scope of the project, but anywhere from 150 to 300 data points per farmer. That's everything from household information to crop information to practices that the farmer is doing when it comes to sustainability attributes like lower water use, lower chemical use of non-GMO seeds in the case of organic agriculture, things like that. And then other information. And so that data is, one, it's difficult to capture. It requires a sustained investment. And it also requires, as Abhisab was saying, the need for engaging the farming communities to see and ask them really what their value is in providing this information. But once we have that information, we're able to attribute that information and get a premium on the bales of cotton that we're able to produce in our program. And those bales of cotton, of course, then go through the value chain and create a higher value end use product, whether that's a t-shirt, pair of jeans, or whatever product that consumers are ultimately buying. The difference between our system and existing certification systems is we can empirically and scientifically, through a verification model and through scientific analysis, prove that something is actually more sustainable, prove that something is certified, not certified organic, something that is actually grown organically whether or not it's certified or not. And that information is so important to brands and retailers as well as consumers, even though consumers may not always, have that level of visibility into the real truth of the matter. But for brands and retailers, they really need to understand their risks, because if that information were to get out, their reputations could be soiled, and or in this new growing regulatory environment, they could be fined substantially and have to deal with the backlash from government regulations. So a lot of the brands that we work with, for example, they might be buying certified organic cotton in their value chains, but then they'll also have the data in our programs, and they know that the farmers aren't really actually doing organic agriculture to the letter of the standard, but they accept the fact that they can still use the 8-letter word or the 7-letter word organic and label that product, even though they know that the farmers are still on that journey toward being organic growers, if that makes sense. So it's real data. I guess.
It does make sense.
And the real data creates value.
So the question is going to be this, right? I mean, everything that you just said, trust, reputation, truth. Some might argue that, with these 3 words, trust, reputation, and truth, it depends on where you're standing. It depends on, who's trusting whom, whose truth are we speaking, whose reputation are we protecting? Okay, so there's a lot of subjectivity behind those words. When we suddenly get to data, there's something different. There is actually a data point, which theoretically someone else can pick up that same data point and should be able to assess it to come to a conclusion that would satisfy them. And so are we seeing, and this is an open question now to all 3 of you, are we seeing a shift where people are not going to give the benefit of the doubt necessarily because you have a reputation, because you have been trusted, because you tell the truth? So whether you're at a brand level, I'm a brand, and for my entire history as a brand, none of my planes have crashed, or I'm an auditor, and for the entire history of everything that I've audited and all the standards that I've done, they've never been proved to be wrong because workers have never run screaming from a burning building. Do you think that things are changing in the views of the regulator with regard to how to evaluate these trust, brand, truth issues? Open question. You can just put up your hand and I'll call on you. Abba Sahib, go ahead.
I think, Bhuvan, in addition to what you said, I think it's more going, more than that. I think what is important today is the transparency. The global, I think we are a global village now, and everybody wants to know from where you are sourcing, how you are sourcing, is there any exploitation, is there anything which is unethical, and that's going to be, I think, it already the new normal, correct? So the declaration, I think people are now expecting facts rather than stories. And the good old days, we had to believe in stories because of there was no technology. So there are technologies like blockchain and all today, which can prove your facts. So it's more fact-driven world than stories-driven world. I think that's my take on your question.
Yes. Andre, and then Crispin.
Right. But I just want to add to that. So the first thing I want to say is from an organization that is looking at merchandise detained under these new human rights due diligence laws on a regular basis. I can tell you a lot of the laws are shaping under the legal premise of rebuttable presumption, right? And so what that argues is that in many cases, there's an assumption that certain things that are taking place, and it's up to the importer of that merchandise to demonstrate that they are not. And so simply from that perspective, if you are in the supply chain, no matter what form of a program you have or backstory or whatever the case may be, you should be looking at that introduction and use of the law in the context of human rights due diligence as a great reset, right? It means that you are now in a position where you need to demonstrate what it is that you have in place. And the fact of the matter is that, and you mentioned the report from Human Rights Watch recently, in which I think that was led up by Aruna, who's a fantastic person, over at Human Rights Watch. And I think the important thing is regulators have all the information that we as an collective industry has. So they have, as you mentioned, they have the pro of the story and they have the con of the story. It would not be responsible as a regulator to simply take in one side of that story and assume that the information, when there is actually an argument that looks to another side, specific to the acceptance of certifications, audits, and all these sorts of things. And so a regulator has no choice but to conduct their own due diligence as it relates to admissibility of merchandise. And the final thing I will say is, as an industry, we are in a position, or industry brands in particular, are in a position that we need to continue to work harder for every inch of, or every centimeter, if you're in Europe, of credibility. That's the reality that this industry is facing. And so therefore, the response of transparency is absolutely right, is that there needs to be different ways to demonstrate at a programmatic level, but also at a transactional admissibility level.
Thanks, Andre. Crispin?
I think I'll take a little separate direction because, let's call it compliance 1.0 is really about building a brand and telling stories. And these were most of the systems that are created in this space, whether social, chemical, or preferred fibers, like the space that I'm in. There are very few actual government regulations. In chemicals, you have the California policies, and some other states have done that. With chemicals, you have REACH in Europe. In the health, the social space, I don't know that there's much legislation globally, except for the Uyghur Act, that actually puts these things into law. And then, of course, on the fiber side, you have the organic regulation, and that's the only one in the entire world in the textile space that has any government policy attached to it. Everything else is voluntary, everything else is private. And so we've built this kind of amoeba of systems that can't actually corroborate the claims that they're making. And I think that a lot of the brands, at least the more forward-thinking brands, and there's this transition, they want to go to a place of honesty and transparency, because the smart ones that are talking to the right consumers are seeing that transparency and the truth is far more valuable for their reputations, as well as the engagement of consumers at the POS, at the retail store, than was opacity and just storytelling in the past. And a lot of the brands that we work with, they're seeing those results, and that is also assuring. So we both have the regulation as well as the commercial incentives to shift this model to primary data, and to shift this model to transparency and data access. And that I think is interesting and really important.
Okay, so we're talking about
drivers,
transparency.
yeah.
So transparency, also unfortunately means different things to different people. I mean, in the conversations that we are all involved in. And we've got a question here from Jen from Labor Solutions, who's actually talking about worker voice. We're going to come to that, because that's going to round off some of the new data that's coming into the system is worker voice. We haven't really had the ability for, as Abasabi, you had said, the bottom of the pyramid to actually speak. And prior to this, it's been very cost prohibitive to go out and survey everybody. But we are now getting to the point where it would be, as you had said, Andre, it's irresponsible if we don't do it, because you can do it now. So really, you should be doing it. So let's just focus a little bit on this word transparency. So maybe first a kind of a yes or no, yes/no question is, would transparency include doing whatever on the ground work you're doing, gathering all of the data that you've got, and then sending it to the brand for vetting before it is released? At which point does transparency happen? Does that raw data set Andre, which you have said, regulators have the pros and cons. If they don't even have that raw data set, does that constitute something which is transparent, is potentially transparent? Is that what regulators are looking for?
So that's a bit of a difficult, it's difficult to say yes or no, right? In a sense that there can be different views about the raw data set, particularly when it comes to the integrity of the data set. And so it's devil in the details sort of things. But I would say fundamentally, the response is yes. Anything that helps to provide greater clarity around the claims that are being made about the admissibility of the merchandise is exactly what a regulator is looking for. But I would tack on to that, it's not just about the transactional occurrence, because when merchandise detentions happen under human rights due diligence laws, people tend to get lost in the economics of the occurrence, right? And so now all of a sudden there are large quantities of money, that are at stake, and so therefore the focus becomes on that transaction. And what most people don't realize is that when transactional merchandise admissibility doesn't work, meaning when you cannot get your product into the market under a human rights due diligence law, most of the times it's as a result of a brand deciding not to pursue it because of a lack of the data that you're referring to, right? So it's not always the regulator saying, hey, we're not admitting the product. The regulator is often asking for credible information to substantiate the claims that you're making. And then sometimes the brands are looking at it, or the importer, I should say, is looking at it from the perspective of, can we make it or can we not? And then they decide to re-export the product. And then there are occasions where it's not just about that data, it also might be at a program level, which we haven't spoke about, but there's also an expectation under these laws that not only can you provide transactional data, but you can also provide evidence of an entire program that's operating within the company, which is also part of the evaluation, right?
Andre, may I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Andre, would you say that just quickly, like with what you said, that neither a brand or the government could, because of the state of this industry, can actually prove probable cause, more or less? Like if you look at it through a legal framework, right? Like there's no discovery, there's no emails, there's just a bunch of, documents that are not you can't corroborate, and then there's a bunch of just hearsay on the other side. And we don't have a case. Nobody has a case.
Well, what I would say is that when the reliance is on one-dimensional forms of information, one end of a line to another end of the line, it's certainly difficult to build confidence. I think the arguments or the discussion that we're having now is really this industry transformation into multi-dimensional forms of information that start to kind of prick at or attack these components of credibility or of questions around data that have been around for many, many years, right? These are not new. I can remember 20 years ago, the same discussion about credibility of organic data, fiber data, or labor claims. And so what's really changed is that now you have not just private sector asking the questions or civil society asking the questions. The big change is that regulators essentially are asking the same question that's always been asked, but it's in the context of the admissibility of your product. And so it puts industry in a position of having to respond, right? It just simply cannot be ignored. And that's the big shift in what we're seeing.
Mm.
So recognizing there's also a question that's just come up from Alexandra at Global Gap. And I'm going to answer that question in the context of what I'm going to ask you, Abba Sahib. The project that we just completed with you, the workers own the data. They own that data themselves, and they have basically licensed that data back to you so that you can prepare a report about the social working conditions in your facility. and that corroborates with your SEDEX report, and you get to use that data once in this report to make a representation, however it is that you wish. So would you then, and to talk to Andre's point, would you volunteer that report to a regulator? Because you are a brand, you are also a manufacturer. If you now had to access the European market, and even though there was no stipulation necessarily under the new due diligence directive, would you use this and be confident to use this in the hope that you would be able to have a license to operate in the European market?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Why not? I think the question is, and I just wanted to add to your last question also, what Andrew and Crispin said. One is data fact corrections, and the second is data processing, correct? I think in the entire transaction, the ethical aspect should be respected from viewpoint of integrity. And if we are doing it from integrity point of view, if my intentions from day one are clear and correct, and if I'm confident that I'm following it through compliance and regulation or whatever you say, and then giving access to direct worker voice and all those things, we are not worried about sharing it with anybody, because we are talking finally the truth, correct? So there's nothing to hide, basically. And that's where I'm pointing out and giving much more and much bigger importance to so-called integrity, because everything you cannot bind under regulation, compliance, and everything. I think we need to give back to the society things which are being perceived by everyone in a clear manner, in a transparent manner. And that's where we stand, Owen.
Okay, so I'm just going to come back to this idea of transparency and how it's been presented so far with data about traceability, right? If we see something today about data and technology in the supply chain space, more often than not, it will be, oh, we know where our stuff comes from. Now, from a social standpoint, for me, that's not good enough, because yes, you may well know that it comes from here, but do you know what's going on there? That's the next question. Okay, so that's the Bluenumber thing. I mean, for me, I can know that stuff is coming from from your factory, but I still don't know beyond what you have said, maybe going on at your factory. Until I hear from the workers, I'm not satisfied. So how is traceability viewed in the realm of the regulator today? Is traceability RegTech? Andre.
Okay. So one thing before answering this question, just one quick thing I want to say is I believe when we use the word transparent, a lot of people on the commercial side of the business sometimes view this terminology as meaning you need to share everything about yourself, right? That transparent means sharing everything. And I'm going to say something a little controversial. It does not always mean that you share everything. It means that your intent is to make sure that people have an accurate and a clear understanding of what it is you're doing, right? And how the information is shared is really determined based on that. And why I say that is because we work with a lot of local groups, particularly in civil society. And sometimes when you talk to workers themselves about the word transparency, when they actually translate the word, they believe we want them to be invisible in the system of the supply chain, right? And so I just think it's very careful that, we need to be very careful when we use these sort of, Western terminologies in the context of the supply chain, that we try to kind of zoom back into who is the party we're concerned about making an impact, and to make sure that there's a connection to what this means to them, right? And then to answer your first question, from our experience in working with with regulators and sort of and brands and importers, I should say, in this space, the important thing are the questions that you can answer around the comprehensiveness of what you're doing, right? The expectation is that you can demonstrate certain sort of minimum fundamentals. Number one is around the origin of your materials. Number two, around the labor standards of the entities that are involved in those production steps of the process. And also number three, it's also taking a step back and it's looking at what your program is, right? Is it well designed? What's the intention of what you're attempting to do? Is it being implemented with earnest and in good faith? And if they were to look at the output of it, would it be deemed to be acting with reasonable care? Or would it seem that you're just simply kind of ticking boxes and things of that nature? That's how a regulator looks at what you're presenting. Even if your argument is, I've made my best effort, they're really going to take a step back and analyze the definition of what your best effort means. And they're going to put you on two sides of the scale. It's either going to be that you're on someone that has kind of egregiously negligent, right? Meaning that on the liability standard, you really didn't care about the law and you did the very bare minimum to implement the law, versus someone on the other side of the scale, which is that you can have an escape. Maybe you did not meet, what they would consider to be adequate, but your intent in terms of program design, in terms of activity and all these sorts of things was to do the right thing. It just simply got through, right? And you need to kind of tighten up your programming. That's how regulators will look at things.
So Crispin, I know you're about to talk, and I'm just going to give you something else to think about now, and it is this. You have actually gone to the product side. A lot of what Andre had said with regard to the processes involved, let's say, the supply chain mechanics of products is pretty well established. I mean, you can more or less trace just from a document trail, simply because there's money changing hands with that product, that you kind of, you've got that more or less done. Supply chain certification, chain of custody, all of those things are done, okay? Now we're gonna, and there's a lot of data that comes out of that, which you can present. Even if you didn't have a visualization of your traceability, you can actually present, look, this is where I bought all my stuff, this is where it came from, it's my bill of lading, etc., all done, right? And it's been so for years. So, and maybe just a quick swipe here. That's why I don't really understand blockchain in this space, because all you're doing is taking stuff that you already knew and making it expensive on blockchain. So, okay, that's a quick swipe. I'm going to come back to Crispin. When you move that kind of data and you start adding onto it social data, right? How do you now do that? I mean, you are working in fiber trace, you're working in all of these other, chemical traceability, et cetera. How does social data come into this framework?
Social data comes into the framework in multitudes, but you're right. Look, there are the most fabulous, incredible digital technology tools out there in the market today. Fiber trace is one of them. No plug, but it's for me, it's one of the best. I'm going to be honest with you. Nobody uses it, and nobody uses any of the other digital traceability solutions because there's no trust, and trust is a prerequisite for transparency and traceability. We're talking about human beings here. There are also Excel formula sheets that you can send out into the world, and nobody fills in the data because there's no interest and there's no incentive. When it comes to adding all these different layers, to go back to your question though, Pooven, we can get any kind of data that we want if we build trust and we build incentives for those data owners to provide that data and make that data credible. Otherwise, we get the guy in the factory who's just trying to get through the audit and he's typing in numbers, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the way that we fill out surveys to get 10% off of our groceries, right? It's the same level of care because it's just passing the test versus actually delivering real value. Now, one of the things at Sorcery is we create very strong bonds with each of the value chain partners. We are commercially neutral in that respect. We're a trading house, but we're commercially neutral. We don't make money from buying and selling the actual product. And that allows us to have very, very deep levels of data that are not privileged data for buying and selling parties, and or should not be released out into the world. But we have that information now. If there was a place like what Bluenumber's created and some of these blockchain tools where that data can be protected and anonymized and not under the influence of human intervention, I think then you have a new regulatory framework that can be trustworthy and bring that level of transparency and that traceability. But again, trust is the prerequisite, and we're not going to get anywhere without trust.
Okay, I'm going to switch. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to switch the topic very clearly to direct worker voice and this new body of data that is coming in. So obviously, you all know Bluenumber's big thing is direct worker voice and compensation, because data has value. And now if you are bringing workers and farmers and so forth into the system, and to talk to your point about incentivization, Crispin, we need to be fair that they are helping those licenses to be obtained. They are helping the credibility of those audits. Therefore, their input needs to be compensated very clearly. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat that now speak to this as well. The first thing is, how do we decide what is appropriate for direct worker voice? And then both in that question and in the following question, there is a link between the data, or a link being drawn between the data from direct worker voice and the application or the expectation of a remedy. So I can tell you that from the Bluenumber perspective, at least, we're saying that these are two different things. One is you have to have data to get into compliance. And then if that data is acted upon so that it delivers a remedy, then that's, of course, the best case scenario. But to suggest that because you are giving data, you are entitled to remedy, that's a different, two different things. So that's my, my position. I've explained this, in many other different ways, but let's get your thoughts on it. Direct worker voice and its relationship to remedy. Abba Sahib.
Hey, Bhuvan, to be very frank, it gives you sort of a very clear opinion from your workers and farmers. In the process of driving excellence or driving transparency, you may or may not be doing some mistakes. So it's a clear evidence from them that what they perceive, is it really important? Are you really, I think somebody mentioned how you treat them. I guess it's a very, very basic question. So I think what we feel, I personally feel, is that I think it gives you a clear hint to rectify your mistakes or sharpen your good practices further. I think that's my take.
Okay, so basically it would give you a direction or a guidance, but what I'm hearing from you is that then you are able to act in, let's say, a more surgical or targeted or effective manner because you have this. And maybe just before I move to Andre and Crispin on this question, you can also comment on, is a direct worker voice system necessarily a grievance mechanism?
Not necessarily, because I think it has different dimensions, correct? So you may take it in different ways. I think there are different findings. For me, when I saw at the report and the way it was designed, I was pretty surprised and then very much benefited. And then I realized that, yes, we need to have, first of all, voice for our bottom-up pyramid. And we need to talk to them regularly. And what happens when you talk one-to-one, their approach is much different. And when you give them liberty to talk, like what you did, you have given them choice. First of all, they have a choice to participate in the survey. I think they participated on their own. Second thing, they participated and they were benefited. The remuneration was given to them. So that definite thing was with them that yes, I'm getting paid for my own data. I'm the owner of that data. And then they responded responsibly and freely. And that was very much instance. I used to talk to my operators and farmers on quite regular basis. But still, when I looked at the answers and all those things, I found them much trustworthy than my direct interaction. Because then there is a factor of influence. Here, there was no factor of influence. So it is much clearer or much transparent than what we so-called anticipate.
Crispin, Andre, direct worker voice, grievance mechanism, thoughts?
I mean, to echo, yeah, to echo, when I'm going back to the transparency and traceability thing, every single supplier in the value chain knows where their product is coming from, and their suppliers know where their product is coming from. It's not a secret. They know transparency, traceability is possible today. Like you said, it's through bill of ladings and invoices. The difference is that nobody's willing to share that with the brands. And I hate to say it so bluntly, but that's the truth. Because of the culture through which is built around modern trade, is if I'm transparent and if I'm going to share real information with an auditor or with somebody who wants it, will that information be used against me, in the sense of you get really authentic information from direct worker voice, right? That then is in a safe place. And that becomes the currency through which we need to make decisions, not the reporting mechanisms that have been dominant for the last 25 years. And I think the other side of it is that, you know, we have to also not just create a safe place, but we have to create more value for this type of data. It's imperative. And again, like I mentioned earlier, the brands and the retailers that see transparency as a profitability center are winning big. Those that see transparency as a threat are going to not be around in the future, right? Because this landscape is changing, either from a regulatory perspective or a consumer trust perspective. And I think we have to recognize both of those and the impacts that primary data and worker voice and primary data generated and corroborated by worker voice and or verification and true verification methodologies will reshape how we actually trade and interact with one another. I think that's an important thing to recognize.
Andre, direct worker voice.
So I would say from our perspective of sort of where the rubber hits the road when used in a true sort of merchandise detention related to human rights due diligence, I would say that it's really an indicator or a critical factor in evaluating or determining whether the program or the claims are adequate, right? It's not necessarily an indicator of action, right? Or it would be called worker action or something of that sort. Or you know, it really is just a way for one to look at if what has been put into place has been designed for adequately for maximum effectiveness, right? But when you take that, let's say on its own, it leaves lots of questions. But then if you kind of take it and add it to other things that you might be doing, what it does is it starts to get back to that multi-dimensional view that I was explaining to you. And so therefore it creates an area of confidence around some of these claims. And just one quick thing I want to also say is that you also have to look at this in the context of kind of where the industry is now. And so today, what you have is this sort of, you know, one-dimensional sort of audit checklist data instrument, which is sort of the primary source of understanding, right? And that is something that we like to say, it doesn't have any form of compassionate inquiry in that instrument. It also doesn't take into account the natural environment that the supplier is facing. Natural environment means things that could be related to the buying practices within the facility. It could mean things that are related to economic circumstances in the area where they're operating, or even their own economic circumstances, and it can go on and on. And so therefore, a social performance sort of checklist that just looks kind of narrowly and squarely at things and kind of leaves out all of these other things that we know are important about having a well-rounded understanding really is challenging. And so therefore, when you integrate instruments like worker voice tools and other sorts of things, what that then does, it starts to give us other indicators about understanding, but it doesn't give us an indicator about action.
Okay, so let me ask you, like a question. So you work a lot with CBP on various issues, right? And let's say you're using the Uyghur Forced Labor UPFLA Act there, and tomorrow, like a massive Christmas present, or let's say windfall profits at BP, every worker in the Uyghur province manages to complete a direct worker voice survey that says, this is the factory I work at, these are the conditions under which I work, these are all the brands that I supply to. And you now get 500,000 pieces of data that come in from that source, geolocated, verified, triangulated, peer-to-peer verified, and so forth. What would CBP do with that data? How would it process that data in the context of all of the other information that it is currently, or the paucity of current information that it has?
Let me just for the point of clarity, we work with lots of different regulators around substantiation of information, as well as brands and civil society. So it's not really about the party we're working with. It's really about what's the claim that we're helping to substantiate, and then hopefully that process then leads us to a result that has better impact for workers, right? Because what we're ultimately after is a well-designed system that encourages the highest labor standards, right? That's what we want to achieve by doing this. But to kind of get back to what you mentioned is that in that case, the fundamental question that would arise is how is that being applied? Right? Now you have all these things in. How is it being applied to get back to the original purpose, which are, the highest labor standards, right? And so,
oh my God.
Sorry, go ahead. There was just another mic.
Yeah. Sure. So that would be sort of the knee-jerk reaction, right? And kind of looking at the data sets. But then it would just simply be rolled back, and it would be looked at from two lenses, one which by most regulators, which is from a transactional, because most of these things happen because you've had, some product that's been, not admitted. And so you're going through the admissibility process. And so it would be looked from that lens of that specific purchase order style, SKU, item number, and kind of going through that specifically for that transaction, but also looking at you as an overall company, because one thing that's important for people to understand is with the new introduction of these human rights due diligence laws, it's not just about the transactional occurrence, it's also about giving regulators an understanding of if you are a low-risk supply chain or you a high-risk supply chain. And so no matter what your story has been in the past, and it might have been a great story, the reality is that each event that happens around your supply chain gives a regulator an opportunity to know the truth about what's happening in your supply chain. And to the extent that you're unable to respond, it paints a very different picture about, you as an organization, right? And they begin to pursue that picture based on that understanding.
Right. So basically, there will be a situation where you are now, you have got the means to answer certain questions. You have got the means to provide certain data. And then if you could not or choose not to, that may raise questions as to, well, what else may be wrong in this scenario, right? Okay, so we've got like 3 minutes left, and I'm going to round off by giving you each sort of a simple question. potentially, when we talk about RegTech, it's data and data plus process. Okay, that's what we've been discussing. You need the data, and then how do you handle that data? How does it fit into the process of making an evaluation? So it's about evidence, and so far we've had a lot of top-down evidence. Basically, an auditor has come in and given an opinion and put it into a report, which obviously is an opinion, and we know that those can be compromised in all sorts of ways. And then now potentially we have this bottom-up mechanism where you have a whole bunch of other data that's coming in from the location. And up until this point, maybe that data has actually filtered through social media and other ways because there was no actual channel or avenue formally to do it. But if you now look at something like RU World and Shayadri Farms, they are opening it up to their workers. They're saying, listen, just tell us, just tell us, just tell. We will listen, other people will listen, and then we'll go from there. And so basically, we get to this condition of verifiable compliance, which therefore should end up in trust. And there was one question in the chat which talked about what would be the rules that govern, what becomes acceptable with regard to data and processes and so forth. When you start adding this new component, whether it's chemical traceability or whether it's direct worker voice, this is all just new data that is, potentially a deluge, where we're bringing the social media and the other things that have been happening in parallel to regulation into the regulatory environment, because why wouldn't you? It would be irresponsible not to do so. So based on that, the question would be, if you could do it, why wouldn't you do it? And would you recommend to anyone whom you are working to get as much data as possible and make it, be open with it? Apart from your commercial implications, which Andre recognized before, but what would there be, to hide? Unfortunately, this is also the kind of the fascist scenario on security and privacy. But what would there be to hide in a supply chain? Quick answers around the room. Abba Sahib.
Really difficult to answer, but I once again will go to integrity. If my integrity is clear, I should not have these questions. I think commercially, yes, I think there are certain things to hide, but otherwise, I think it should be open.
Crispin. Mute, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'd say if there's no consequences and there's no bad actors, right? There's nothing to hide, even commercial information. It's okay that, to tell somebody that cotton, it takes 84 cents to produce and it's being sold on the market for 78. There's a problem. It's not going to work. This is what's happening all over India. So if we're truly honest and open, we don't have anything to hide, and then trade actually flows very efficiently. The question becomes is how do you identify those folks that are going to use that information in a negative way? And that becomes, for us, I mean, we ended up, working, of course, and starting to build the Bluenumber system in our data, because our data is so valuable that our prior data storage company or whatever got investment from a search engine that we all use. And I said, no, thanks, not putting my data in that system. Sorry. And again, I'm using that anecdotally because the value of data we have is so important for growers. It's so important for the supply chain, but it's also potentially very damning for all these actors along the chain. So it has to be in a place that's very safe. And that's where we look at process as important to protect the interests of the data owners, but also the interests of all of our, what we call partners in sorcery.
Thanks, Crispin. Andre, last word.
I would say that I would not recommend that people collect as much data as you can unless you plan to act on it. I think that's very important, or you could create more harm than you are good. I think what people should do is focus on creating and using a smart mix of tools, and particularly these types of worker voice instruments that we're talking about today, and that they should focus on making sure that those smart mix of tools are adequately integrated in a program designed for maximum effectiveness and preventing harm, right? And that's what should be the strategy.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank all three of you for your comments, your expert insights. Really excellent conversation. Thank you all to those who have joined the session. I hope that this was valuable. I'm sure that I speak on behalf of everyone else here to say that if you want to reach out to any of us individually to take this conversation a bit further, please do. We're all on LinkedIn, and I've put into the chat a link about direct worker voice. That speaks to the standards of what would be acceptable with regard to direct worker voice. There's a specific question in the chat about that. We have begun a process. We started at the end of last year in order to be looking at what's good data. How do we ensure that there isn't data exploitation? How can we push that to regulators? So I would welcome anybody to join that process. You can just sign up online, and then we go from there. As I said, this will be available on YouTube, a recording of this, and thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers. Thanks, Pooven. Bye.
Thank you, Pawan.